Hey guys, tonight we dive into the dark, disturbing, and surprisingly recent world of mental illness treatment throughout history. Those tortured souls who were beaten, exorcised, and electrocuted in the name of healing. While modern medicine makes us feel enlightened, the reality is that mental health treatment has been a nightmare of ignorance, cruelty, and good intentions gone horribly wrong. So before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see our global audience. Now grab something comforting, maybe turn down the lights, and let's explore the horrifying journey of how humanity has tried to heal the mind. Let's destroy the first comforting myth right away. Mental illness treatment didn't gradually improve over time in a nice, steady progression from ignorance to enlightenment. It was a chaotic mess of superstition, pseudoscience, and occasional accidental progress. For most of human history, if you showed signs of mental illness, you weren't a patient needing help. You were possessed by demons, cursed by witches, or being punished by God for your sins. And the treatments? They were designed to drive out evil spirits, not heal human brains. Being mentally ill in ancient times meant you were everyone's problem and no one's responsibility. Your family might chain you in the basement or abandon you in the wilderness. Your community might stone you, burn you, or simply pretend you didn't exist. There was no understanding that mental illness was actually illness. It was moral failing, supernatural punishment, or divine testing. And the solutions were equally supernatural. Ancient civilizations had their own creative approaches to mental health. The Egyptians thought mental illness came from the heart and uterus, so they'd perform surgical procedures that had nothing to do with the brain. They'd remove organs, apply heated metals to the body, and force patients to drink concoctions made from crocodile dung and human urine. The logic was that mental disturbance was caused by physical contamination that needed to be purged from the body through increasingly extreme measures. The Greeks at least recognized that the brain might be involved, but their solution was trepanation. Drilling holes in skulls to let the evil spirits escape. Imagine being depressed and having someone attack your head with primitive tools because they thought your sadness was caused by trapped demons. The procedure was performed without anesthesia, often using sharpened stones or crude metal implements. Many patients died from infection, blood loss, or brain damage, but the few who survived and seemed calmer were hailed as proof that the treatment worked. Greek physicians like Hippocrates made some attempts at more rational approaches, theorizing that mental illness came from imbalances in bodily humors. But their treatments were still barbaric. They believed that madness was caused by too much black bile, so they'd induce massive vomiting, diarrhea, and bleeding to restore balance. Patients would be starved for days, then force-fed purgatives that would leave them dehydrated and weak. The theory was that physical suffering would drive out the mental affliction. The Romans weren't much better. They believed mental illness was caused by an imbalance of bodily fluids, so they'd bleed patients, make them vomit, or force them to take massive doses of laxatives. Feeling anxious? Let's drain half your blood and see if that helps. Experiencing hallucinations? Here's a powerful emetic that'll make you vomit for hours. The logic was that if you could purge the bad humors from the body, the mind would naturally heal. Roman treatments also included chains, cages, and public humiliation. Wealthy families would hire guards to chase their mentally ill relatives through the streets with whips, believing that terror and pain would shock them back to sanity. Poor patients were thrown into prison-like cells where they'd be left to rot. The Romans did develop some of the first institutions specifically for mental patients, but these were essentially human zoos where people could pay to watch the inmates for entertainment. Some Roman physicians experimented with what they called shock therapy, which involved suddenly terrifying patients with loud noises, wild animals, or threats of death. They believed that extreme fear would reset the mind and cure madness. Patients were thrown into pits with snakes, locked in rooms with starving animals, or told they were about to be executed. Many died of heart failure or injury sustained during these treatments, but those who survived in a state of traumatized compliance were considered cured. The use of restraints in Roman medicine was particularly cruel. Patients were chained to walls for months or years, developing bedsores, muscle atrophy, and additional mental trauma from prolonged isolation. Some were fitted with iron masks or helmets designed to prevent them from harming themselves or others. These devices often caused infections, breathing problems, and permanent disfigurement, but they were seen as necessary medical equipment rather than torture devices. But it was the rise of Christianity that really turned mental illness treatment into a horror show. Suddenly, mental illness wasn't just medical ignorance, it was theological warfare. If you heard voices, you were talking to demons. If you had mood swings, you were fighting a spiritual battle. If you couldn't think clearly, Satan had invaded your soul. And the church had very specific ideas about how to handle demonic possession. Medieval mental health treatment was essentially organized torture disguised as spiritual healing. Exorcisms involved hours of screaming, physical abuse, starvation, and psychological torment. Priests would beat patients with crosses, force them to drink holy water until they vomited, and perform elaborate rituals that were designed to make evil spirits so uncomfortable they'd leave the body. The patient's suffering was seen as necessary collateral damage in the war between good and evil. The process of exorcism could last for days or weeks. Patients would be deprived of food and sleep, subjected to constant prayers and incantations, and physically restrained in uncomfortable positions. They'd be forced to consume massive quantities of holy water, blessed wine, and consecrated bread until they became violently ill. The vomiting and diarrhea that resulted from this forced consumption were interpreted as demons being expelled from the body. Some patients were burned at the stake as witches or heretics. Others were locked away in monastery dungeons where they'd be forgotten for years. The lucky ones might be sent on religious pilgrimages, forced to walk hundreds of miles while begging for divine intervention. Mental illness wasn't a medical condition, it was a spiritual crisis that required spiritual solutions, no matter how brutal those solutions might be. The church developed elaborate theories about different types of demons that could possess the mentally ill. Violent patients were thought to be inhabited by demons of wrath, while depressed individuals were possessed by demons of despair. Each type of demon required specific rituals and treatments. Some exorcists would attempt to negotiate with the demons, demanding to know their names and origins. Patients who played along with these delusions might receive slightly better treatment, while those who resisted were subjected to even more extreme measures. Medieval monasteries became dumping grounds for inconvenient family members. Wealthy families would pay to have mentally ill relatives confined in monastery cells, where they'd be subjected to daily exorcisms and forced religious instruction. The monks believed that constant prayer and religious study could drive out demons, so patients were forced to memorize scriptures, attend multiple daily services, and participate in religious rituals regardless of their mental state. Some monasteries developed specialized techniques for treating different forms of madness. Patients who exhibited sexual behaviors were subjected to particularly harsh treatment, including genital mutilation, ice baths, and forced celibacy vows. Those who blasphemed or spoke against the church were often tortured with hot irons or branded with religious symbols. The goal wasn't just to cure mental illness but to purify the soul through suffering. But here's the twisted part. Sometimes these barbaric treatments actually seemed to work, not because they drove out demons, but because they accidentally addressed real psychological needs. The intense attention and ritual involved in exorcism could provide structure and meaning for people whose minds were chaotic. The community involvement in religious healing could combat the isolation that worsened mental illness. And the powerful suggestion that divine intervention was possible could trigger genuine psychological improvements. This accidental success convinced medieval authorities that their methods were correct, ensuring that supernatural approaches to mental illness would persist for centuries. They weren't healing mental illness, they were occasionally stumbling onto effective psychological interventions while torturing people in the name of God. And they had no idea what they were actually doing right or wrong. The concept of divine punishment for sin became so embedded in mental health treatment that families would often see mental illness as a sign of moral failing. Parents would blame themselves for their children's conditions, believing that their own sins had brought divine retribution upon their offspring. This guilt led to even more extreme religious treatments, as families desperately sought to atone for whatever transgression had caused the affliction. Medieval Islamic medicine took somewhat different approaches, with physicians like Al-Razi and Ibn Sina attempting more systematic observations of mental illness. However, their treatments still relied heavily on bloodletting, purging, and physical restraints. Islamic hospitals did develop some of the first specialized wards for mental patients, but these were often places of confinement rather than healing. Patients were chained, beaten, and subjected to various forms of shock therapy designed to restore their reason through fear and pain. So no, ancient mental health treatment wasn't primitive but well-intentioned. It was a systematic nightmare based on fundamental misunderstanding of what mental illness actually was. And the people who suffered from it weren't patients, they were casualties in humanity's war against the unknown. The Renaissance brought new ideas about science and medicine, but mental illness treatment remained stuck in the Dark Ages. While artists were painting masterpieces and scientists were mapping the stars, people with mental illness were still being chained in dungeons, tortured with hot irons, and subjected to treatments that would be recognized as war crimes today. The rise of early mental hospitals, or madhouses, as they were called, represented progress only in the sense that society was finally admitting that mental illness existed. But these institutions were essentially human warehouses where inconvenient people could be stored and forgotten. Families would pay to have embarrassing relatives locked away, and authorities would dump anyone who couldn't care for themselves into these hellholes. Bethlem Royal Hospital in London, famously known as Bedlam, became the template for mental health institutions across Europe. Patients were chained to walls, kept naked in freezing cells, and put on display like zoo animals for paying visitors who came for entertainment. The hospital charged admission fees for the public to come gawk at the lunatics, turning human suffering into a profitable spectacle. Visitors would poke patients with sticks, throw food at them, and laugh at their distress as part of a popular form of entertainment. The conditions at Bedlam were beyond horrific. Patients were kept in cells with straw floors that were changed only rarely, creating breeding grounds for disease and parasites. Many developed severe infections from untreated wounds and exposure to their own waste. The food was often spoiled or contaminated, and fresh water was scarce. Deaths from starvation, disease, and exposure were common, but were rarely investigated or recorded. Treatment methods were based on the theory that mental illness was caused by too much blood in the brain, so patients were regularly bled until they passed out. They were spun in rotating chairs until they vomited and lost consciousness, supposedly to redistribute the blood flow. They were dunked in ice-cold water repeatedly, shocked with primitive electrical devices, and subjected to other tortures that doctors genuinely believed were therapeutic. The spinning chair, invented by Dr. Benjamin Rush in America, was considered a major medical breakthrough. Patients would be strapped into a chair and spun at high speeds for hours, often until they lost consciousness or became violently ill. The theory was that centrifugal force would redistribute blood flow to the brain and cure madness. In reality, many patients suffered permanent brain damage from the repeated trauma, while others died from injuries sustained during the spinning sessions. Water treatments became increasingly sophisticated and cruel. Patients would be strapped into wooden chairs and lowered into freezing water for extended periods. Others were subjected to high-pressure water hoses that could break bones and cause internal injuries. The cold water cure involved plunging patients into ice baths until they went into shock, then rapidly warming them in hot baths. Many died from the extreme temperature changes, but doctors attributed these deaths to the severity of the patient's condition rather than the treatment itself. The wealthy could afford private madhouses that were marginally less horrific, but even these facilities operated on the assumption that mental illness was a form of moral weakness that required punishment and control. Patients were kept in isolation, forbidden to speak, and subjected to rigid schedules designed to break their will and force them into compliance. Private institutions often used more subtle forms of torture, including sensory deprivation, forced labor, and psychological manipulation. Women had it particularly bad during this period. Any behavior that deviated from social expectations could be labeled as hysteria or moral insanity. Wives who disagreed with their husbands, daughters who refused arranged marriages, or women who showed any signs of sexuality could be institutionalized indefinitely. Mental health diagnosis became a tool for enforcing social conformity, especially against women who challenged traditional gender roles. The treatment of women in madhouses was especially brutal. They were often subjected to gynecological procedures that were supposed to cure their mental afflictions. Doctors believed that the uterus was the source of female madness, leading to treatments that included surgical removal of ovaries, clitoral circumcision, and the insertion of various devices into the vagina to correct the position of the womb. These procedures were performed without anesthesia and often resulted in infection, permanent injury, or death. The concept of moral treatment emerged in the late 1700s, promising a more humane approach to mental illness. Reformers like Philippe Pinel in France and William Tuke in England argued that mental patients should be treated with kindness and respect rather than violence and restraint. They removed chains, improved living conditions, and tried to engage patients in productive activities. But even moral treatment was based on flawed assumptions about mental illness. The goal wasn't to understand or cure psychological conditions, but to train patients to behave properly. Good behavior was rewarded with better food and accommodations, while bad behavior was punished with isolation and reduced privileges. The ultimate objective was to make patients compliant enough to function in society, not to address the underlying causes of their distress. The moral treatment movement did lead to some genuine improvements in patient care. Institutions began providing regular meals, clean clothing, and basic medical attention. Patients were allowed to exercise, engage in crafts, and participate in educational activities. Some facilities even provided entertainment and social interactions that had been completely absent from earlier institutions. However, these improvements were often limited to wealthy patients who could afford better accommodations. This period also saw the rise of phrenology, the pseudoscience that claimed personality and mental illness could be diagnosed by feeling the bumps on someone's skull. Doctors would run their hands over patients' heads, claim to detect criminal tendencies or moral defects, and prescribe treatments based on these ridiculous assessments. It was astrology for the brain, complete nonsense dressed up as medical science. Phrenologists developed elaborate charts showing which areas of the skull corresponded to different personality traits and mental faculties. They claimed that bumps in certain areas indicated overdevelopment of specific brain regions, while depression suggested underdevelopment. Treatments were designed to either stimulate or suppress these regions through various manipulations of the skull. Some practitioners used ice or heat applications, while others employed mechanical devices designed to reshape the skull over time. The influence of phrenology extended far beyond mental hospitals. Criminal courts began using phrenological assessments to determine guilt or innocence, while schools used them to evaluate students' intellectual potential. The pseudoscience provided a seemingly scientific justification for existing prejudices about race, gender, and social class. People with unfavorable skull shapes were often denied employment, education, or other opportunities based on phrenological assessments. The 19th century brought new theories about mental illness, but most of them were equally wrong and often more dangerous than what came before. The rise of scientific racism led to claims that mental illness was more common in certain ethnic groups. The eugenics movement argued that mental illness was hereditary and that affected individuals should be sterilized or eliminated to improve the human race. Mental hospitals grew larger and more institutional, warehousing thousands of patients in overcrowded, understaffed facilities. The goal shifted from treatment to containment, and many patients spent their entire lives locked away from society. Families would commit relatives for minor behavioral problems, and once someone was institutionalized, they rarely got out. The legal system made it extremely difficult for patients to challenge their commitment or secure their release. These massive institutions became cities unto themselves, with their own farms, workshops, and utilities. Patients were forced to work in these facilities, providing free labor that helped offset the costs of their care. The work was often dangerous and exhausting, with patients operating machinery, handling toxic chemicals, and performing tasks that would have been illegal in regular workplaces. Many were injured or killed in industrial accidents that were covered up by hospital administrators. The architecture of 19th-century mental hospitals reflected the prevailing attitudes toward mental illness. Buildings were designed like prisons, with thick walls, barred windows, and locked doors. Patient wards were often located in basement levels with poor ventilation and lighting. The design emphasized security and control over comfort or therapeutic value. Some hospitals were built in remote locations specifically to isolate patients from society and make escape impossible. So while the Renaissance and Enlightenment brought progress in many areas of human knowledge, mental illness treatment remained trapped in ignorance, cruelty, and social prejudice. The chains might have been removed, but they were replaced with chemical restraints, psychological manipulation, and systematic dehumanization that was arguably worse than outright torture. The late 19th and early 20th centuries marked the beginning of what would become modern psychiatry, but the transition was anything but smooth. New theories about mental illness emerged, along with treatments that were often more dangerous than the conditions they were supposed to cure. This was the era when medicine finally admitted that mental illness involved the brain, but their attempts to fix broken minds created some of the most horrifying chapters in medical history. The discovery that syphilis could cause mental symptoms led to the revolutionary idea that other mental illnesses might have physical causes. This should have been progress, but it resulted in desperate attempts to find biological cures for psychological problems. Doctors began experimenting on mental patients with treatments that had no scientific basis but seemed logical given their limited understanding of brain function. The search for biological causes led to increasingly invasive diagnostic procedures. Doctors would perform spinal taps to examine cerebrospinal fluid, inject patients with various chemicals to study their effects on behavior, and even remove pieces of brain tissue for examination. Many of these procedures were performed without the patient's consent or understanding, turning mental hospitals into research laboratories where human experimentation was routine. Hydrotherapy became popular, involving subjecting patients to high-pressure water hoses, prolonged immersion in hot or cold baths, and continuous wet sheet wraps that could last for hours. The theory was that extreme temperature changes would shock the nervous system back into normal function. In reality, patients often developed hypothermia, pneumonia, or drowned during these treatments. The continuous bath treatment involved keeping patients immersed in water for days or weeks at a time. They would be placed in specially designed tubs with canvas covers that left only their heads exposed. The constant moisture caused severe skin problems, infections, and psychological trauma from the sensory deprivation and isolation. Many patients developed a condition called bath syndrome, becoming completely dependent on the water environment and unable to function outside the tub. Mechanical restraints evolved into sophisticated torture devices during this period. The tranquilizing chair immobilized patients completely while applying pressure to their heads. Rotating machines spun patients at high speeds until they lost consciousness. Shock boxes delivered electrical jolts to various parts of the body. All of these devices were marketed as therapeutic innovations that would revolutionize mental health care. The restraint technology became increasingly elaborate and expensive. Hospitals competed to purchase the latest mechanical devices for controlling patient behavior. The crib bed enclosed patients in wooden cages barely large enough for them to lie down. The muff was a straitjacket-like device that completely immobilized the arms and hands. The mask covered the patient's face to prevent biting or spitting. Each device was presented as a humane alternative to older restraint methods, but they often caused more suffering than what they replaced. The lobotomy era represents perhaps the darkest period in mental health treatment history. Portuguese neurologist Antonio Agos Moniz developed the procedure based on limited observations of brain-injured patients who seemed calmer after frontal lobe damage. The technique involved drilling holes in the skull and severing connections in the frontal cortex, essentially performing controlled brain damage to alter personality and behavior. The development of lobotomy was based on a single case study of a violent chimpanzee that became docile after brain surgery. Moniz extrapolated from this animal experiment to human mental illness, assuming that aggressive or disturbed behavior could be eliminated by destroying specific brain regions. He performed his first human lobotomy in 1935, and the procedure quickly spread to other countries despite the lack of scientific evidence supporting its effectiveness. American neurologist Walter Freeman popularized lobotomy in the United States, developing the transorbital lobotomy technique that could be performed in doctors' offices without surgical facilities. Using an instrument that looked like an ice pick, Freeman would insert it through the eye socket and move it around to destroy brain tissue. He performed thousands of these procedures, often on patients who weren't mentally ill but simply difficult to manage. Freeman's transorbital lobotomy technique was designed for speed and convenience rather than precision or safety. He could perform the procedure in less than 10 minutes, often without proper surgical preparation or sterile conditions. He would hammer the ice pick-like instrument through the thin bone above the eye socket, then move it back and forth to destroy frontal lobe tissue. The lack of precision meant that different amounts of brain tissue were destroyed in each patient, leading to unpredictable and often catastrophic results. Lobotomy was prescribed for everything from depression and anxiety to homosexuality and political dissent. Children as young as 4 years old underwent the procedure. Patients were rarely informed about the risks, which included personality changes, cognitive impairment, and death. Many lobotomy patients became docile vegetables who required lifelong care, but this was considered a success because they were no longer disruptive. The procedure's popularity peaked in the 1940s and 1950s, when thousands of lobotomies were performed annually in the United States alone. Freeman traveled the country in a van he called his lobotomobile, performing operations at hospitals and mental institutions. He was celebrated as a medical pioneer, and Antonio Egas Moniz won the Nobel Prize in Medicine for developing the technique. Freeman's promotional tours resembled circus performances more than medical demonstrations. He would perform multiple lobotomies in a single day, often with journalists and photographers present to document his work. He encouraged other doctors to learn the technique and provided simplified instructions that allowed non-surgeons to perform the procedure. This led to lobotomies being performed by family doctors, psychiatrists, and even some non-medical personnel. The selection criteria for lobotomy patients was often arbitrary and discriminatory. Women who were considered sexually promiscuous, children who were difficult to control, and adults who challenged authority were all candidates for the procedure. Homosexuality was considered a mental illness that could be cured by lobotomy, leading to the mutilation of countless individuals whose only crime was their sexual orientation. Many lobotomy patients were completely transformed by the procedure, losing their personalities, memories, and ability to function independently. Some became catatonic, while others developed severe behavioral problems that were worse than their original conditions. A significant number died during or shortly after the procedure from bleeding, infection, or brain damage. But these failures were often covered up or attributed to the severity of the patient's original condition. Electroshock therapy, or electroconvulsive therapy, emerged as another supposedly scientific treatment for mental illness. Doctors noticed that patients with epilepsy seemed to have fewer psychotic episodes, so they decided to artificially induce seizures in mental patients using electrical current. Early ECT was performed without anesthesia or muscle relaxants, causing patients to convulse so violently they often broke bones or dislocated joints. The development of electroshock therapy was based on the mistaken belief that epilepsy and schizophrenia were incompatible conditions. Italian neurologist Ugo Cerletti began experimenting with electrical stimulation after observing epileptic patients in his hospital. He theorized that artificially induced seizures could cure mental illness by resetting the brain's electrical activity. His first human experiments were performed on homeless individuals and unclaimed patients who couldn't consent to the procedure. The procedure was initially used for schizophrenia, but soon expanded to treat depression, anxiety, homosexuality, and behavioral problems in children. Patients would be strapped to tables and subjected to electrical shocks that caused full-body seizures and temporary memory loss. Many patients developed permanent memory problems or other neurological damage from the repeated electrical trauma to their brains. The early electroshock machines were crude devices that delivered inconsistent amounts of electrical current. There was no standardization of voltage, duration, or frequency of treatments. Some patients received hundreds of shock treatments over the course of their hospitalization. The electrical current would cause such violent muscle contractions that patients often suffered compression fractures of the spine, broken teeth, and dislocated joints. The psychological trauma of electroshock therapy was often as damaging as the physical effects. Patients lived in constant fear of their next treatment session, often becoming catatonic or attempting suicide to avoid the procedure. Many lost significant portions of their memory, forgetting family members, life experiences, and basic skills. Some never recovered their previous level of cognitive function, suffering permanent brain damage from the repeated electrical assaults. Insulin shock therapy involved injecting patients with massive doses of insulin to induce diabetic comas. The theory was that the coma would somehow reset the brain and cure mental illness. Patients would slip into unconsciousness for hours or days, and many never woke up. Those who survived often suffered brain damage from prolonged low blood sugar, but doctors considered any change in behavior to be therapeutic progress. The insulin coma treatment was developed by Austrian physician Manfred Sockel, who claimed that putting patients into controlled comas would allow their brains to heal. The procedure involved carefully calculated doses of insulin designed to lower blood sugar to dangerous levels without immediately killing the patient. Medical staff would monitor patients for signs of coma onset, then attempt to revive them with glucose injections before permanent brain damage occurred. The margin of error for insulin shock therapy was extremely narrow. Too little insulin would fail to induce a coma, while too much would kill the patient or cause irreversible brain damage. Many patients died during treatment sessions, while others suffered permanent cognitive impairment. The few who seemed to improve were likely responding to the intensive medical attention they received during the treatment rather than the coma itself. Chemical restraints replaced physical chains as the preferred method of patient control. Powerful sedatives kept patients docile and manageable, but at the cost of their cognitive function and physical health. Drug cocktails were administered without regard for side effects or long-term consequences, turning mental hospitals into pharmaceutical testing grounds where patients were unwilling experimental subjects. The early psychiatric drugs were often more dangerous than therapeutic. Chloral hydrate, barbiturates, and opium derivatives were used to sedate patients into compliance. These drugs were highly addictive and could cause respiratory depression, cardiac problems, and death from overdose. Patients who became dependent on these substances often developed additional mental health problems related to drug withdrawal and addiction. Some hospitals experimented with exotic chemical treatments that had no scientific basis. Patients were injected with heavy metals like mercury and lead, administered massive doses of vitamins and hormones, and given experimental drugs that were too dangerous to test on animals. The lack of ethical oversight meant that any substance that might theoretically affect brain function could be tested on mental patients without their knowledge or consent. The sterilization movement gained momentum during this period, with tens of thousands of mental patients forcibly sterilized to prevent them from reproducing. The Supreme Court upheld these practices in the 1927 case Buck v. Bell, with Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes writing that 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. Mental illness was seen as a genetic defect that needed to be eliminated from the human population. The eugenics movement provided a pseudoscientific justification for the systematic sterilization of people with mental illness, intellectual disabilities, and other conditions deemed undesirable. State laws were passed requiring sterilization of institutionalized patients, and many were operated on without their knowledge or consent. The procedures were often performed under the guise of other medical treatments, with patients told they were having appendectomies or other routine surgeries. The sterilization programs disproportionately targeted women, minorities, and the poor. Single mothers, promiscuous women, and those who challenged social norms were often labeled as mentally defective and sterilized to prevent them from having more children. The programs continued well into the 1970s, with over 65,000 Americans sterilized against their will. Many victims didn't learn what had been done to them until decades later, when they sought medical treatment for infertility. So while the early 20th century marked the beginning of scientific approaches to mental health, it also produced some of the most barbaric treatments in medical history. The desire to find biological cures for mental illness led to experiments that would be considered torture by any reasonable standard. Patients became guinea pigs in a desperate search for quick fixes that ignored the complex psychological and social factors that contribute to mental health problems. The introduction of psychiatric medications in the 1950s revolutionized mental health treatment, but the early years of psychopharmacology were marked by the same trial-and-error approach that had characterized previous treatments. The first antipsychotic drugs were discovered accidentally, and their widespread adoption led to both genuine therapeutic breakthroughs and new forms of chemical abuse. Chlorpromazine, marketed as Thorazine, was originally developed as an antihistamine but was found to have powerful sedative effects. French psychiatrist Jean Delay began using it to calm agitated patients, and the results seemed miraculous. For the first time, psychiatric hospitals could manage psychotic patients without restraints or isolation. The drug reduced hallucinations, delusions, and violent behavior, allowing many patients to function more normally. The introduction of Thorazine marked the beginning of the pharmaceutical revolution in psychiatry. Hospital administrators were thrilled to find a chemical solution to patient management problems. Violent and agitated patients could be quickly subdued with injections, eliminating the need for expensive restraint equipment and reducing staff injuries. The drug was so effective at controlling behavior that it was soon being used on any patient who was deemed difficult or disruptive. But Thorazine and other early antipsychotics came with devastating side effects that weren't fully understood for decades. Long-term use caused tardive dyskinesia, a neurological condition that produces involuntary movements and facial tics. Patients developed Parkinson's-like symptoms, severe weight gain, and metabolic problems. Many became zombie-like, losing their personality and emotional responsiveness along with their psychiatric symptoms. The side effects of early antipsychotic medications were often worse than the original symptoms they were meant to treat. Patients would develop uncontrollable tongue movements, facial grimacing, and body tremors that marked them as mentally ill even when their psychotic symptoms were controlled. Many became so sedated that they couldn't participate in normal activities or maintain relationships. The drugs provided chemical restraint rather than genuine healing. The pharmaceutical industry seized on the success of psychiatric medications, rushing new drugs to market with minimal testing and aggressive marketing campaigns. Doctors were encouraged to prescribe these powerful chemicals for increasingly broad categories of mental health problems. Drug companies funded research, sponsored conferences, and provided financial incentives for psychiatrists who prescribed their products. The marketing of psychiatric drugs became increasingly sophisticated and manipulative. Companies hired former patients to testify about the benefits of medication, funded patient advocacy groups that promoted pharmaceutical solutions, and sponsored medical conferences that were essentially marketing events. Doctors were bombarded with promotional materials that exaggerated benefits while minimizing risks and side effects. Antidepressants followed a similar pattern of accidental discovery and widespread adoption. Iproniazid, originally developed to treat tuberculosis, was found to improve mood in patients. This led to the development of monoamine oxidase inhibitors and tricyclic antidepressants, drugs that could alleviate depression but also caused serious side effects including heart problems, sexual dysfunction, and increased suicide risk in some patients. The early antidepressants were dangerous drugs with narrow therapeutic windows. Overdoses could be fatal, and interactions with common foods and medications could cause dangerous spikes in blood pressure. Patients had to follow strict dietary restrictions, avoiding aged cheeses, wine, and many other foods that could trigger life-threatening reactions. Despite these risks, the drugs were widely prescribed for everything from grief to shyness. The marketing of psychiatric medications created new categories of mental illness and expanded the definition of who needed treatment. Shyness became social anxiety disorder, mood swings became bipolar disorder, and normal grief became major depression. The medicalization of human emotion turned pharmaceutical companies into some of the most profitable businesses in the world while creating millions of new patients who might not have needed treatment. The expansion of psychiatric diagnosis was driven largely by the need to market new drugs rather than genuine medical advances. Pharmaceutical companies would identify target populations for their products, then fund research to establish new diagnostic categories that would justify prescribing their medications. This process turned normal human experiences into medical conditions requiring pharmaceutical intervention. Benzodiazepines like Valium and Xanax were marketed as safe alternatives to earlier sedatives, but they proved to be highly addictive and difficult to discontinue. Millions of people, particularly women, became dependent on these "mother's little helpers" that were prescribed for everything from anxiety to marital problems. The benzodiazepine epidemic created a new class of drug addicts who had become dependent through legitimate medical treatment. The marketing of benzodiazepines was particularly aggressive and deceptive. The drugs were promoted as non-addictive alternatives to barbiturates and alcohol, despite early evidence of dependence potential. Advertisements targeted housewives and working women, suggesting that these drugs could help them cope with the stresses of modern life. Doctors were encouraged to prescribe them liberally for any signs of anxiety or stress. The benzodiazepine addiction crisis revealed the dangers of pharmaceutical marketing that prioritized profits over patient safety. Millions of people who sought help for legitimate anxiety problems found themselves trapped in cycles of dependence and withdrawal. The drugs were so difficult to discontinue that many patients remained on them for decades, suffering long-term cognitive impairment and emotional blunting. The deinstitutionalization movement of the 1960s and 1970s promised to free mental patients from the horrors of institutional care, but it was largely driven by cost-cutting rather than humanitarian concerns. State hospitals were closed or downsized, and thousands of chronic mental patients were discharged into communities that lacked adequate support services. Many ended up homeless, in prison, or cycling through emergency rooms and short-term psychiatric facilities. The promise of community-based mental health care was never adequately funded or implemented. Politicians who supported deinstitutionalization failed to provide the resources necessary for community treatment programs. The money saved by closing state hospitals was not redirected to community services, leaving former patients without any form of ongoing care or support. Community mental health centers were supposed to provide ongoing care for discharged patients, but they were chronically underfunded and understaffed. The promise of community-based treatment became a cruel joke for patients who found themselves abandoned without the institutional support they needed. Families were left to cope with severely mentally ill relatives who had no access to appropriate care. The results of deinstitutionalization were predictable and tragic. Mental patients who had been warehoused in institutions were now warehoused in nursing homes, homeless shelters, and jails. The quality of care didn't improve, it just moved to different locations. Many former patients found themselves in worse conditions than they had experienced in state hospitals, without even the minimal medical supervision they had received in institutional settings. The rise of managed care in the 1980s and 1990s further restricted access to mental health treatment. Insurance companies limited the number of therapy sessions they would cover, required prior authorization for psychiatric medications, and created financial incentives for providers to offer the cheapest possible treatments. The focus shifted from comprehensive care to symptom management, with an emphasis on quick fixes rather than long-term therapeutic relationships. Managed care companies hired administrators with no mental health training to make treatment decisions based solely on cost considerations. Patients were limited to brief therapy sessions that barely allowed time to establish rapport with their therapists. Psychiatric hospitalizations were restricted to the absolute minimum, often discharging patients who were still actively suicidal or psychotic because their insurance benefits had been exhausted. The profit motive in managed care created perverse incentives that prioritized shareholder returns over patient welfare. Companies were rewarded for denying or limiting treatment, while providers were penalized for spending too much time with patients or prescribing expensive medications. The human cost of these policies was enormous, but it was hidden in statistics about treatment compliance and readmission rates rather than acknowledged as a systematic failure of the healthcare system. Emergency psychiatric services became the de facto mental health system for many Americans. Hospital emergency rooms, which were never designed to provide psychiatric care, became dumping grounds for people in mental health crises. Patients in acute distress were often kept in restraints for hours or days while waiting for psychiatric beds that didn't exist. The emergency room became a revolving door for people who needed ongoing care but could only access crisis intervention. Emergency room staff, who had little training in mental health care, often resorted to chemical restraints and physical force to manage psychiatric patients. The chaotic environment of the emergency room was particularly traumatic for people experiencing psychotic episodes or severe anxiety. Many patients developed additional trauma symptoms from their treatment in emergency settings, compounding their original mental health problems. The emergency mental health system became a form of institutional neglect that was arguably worse than the old state hospital system. At least state hospitals provided ongoing care, however inadequate. The emergency system provided only crisis stabilization, leaving patients to cycle repeatedly through acute care settings without ever receiving the comprehensive treatment they needed for recovery. This period also saw the rise of forensic psychiatry as mental illness became increasingly criminalized. People with untreated mental illness were more likely to end up in the criminal justice system than the mental health system. Jails and prisons became the largest mental health facilities in many states, housing people whose primary problem was psychiatric illness but who were treated as criminals rather than patients. The criminalization of mental illness was a direct result of the failure to provide adequate community-based treatment following deinstitutionalization. Without access to mental health services, people with psychiatric conditions often engaged in minor criminal behaviors related to their symptoms. Homelessness, substance abuse, and public disturbances became criminal justice problems rather than public health issues. Prison mental health care was often worse than what had been available in state hospitals. Inmates with mental illness were frequently placed in solitary confinement, which exacerbated their psychiatric symptoms. They were denied adequate medication, subjected to excessive force by guards who didn't understand mental illness, and provided with minimal therapeutic services. Many developed additional mental health problems as a result of the trauma of incarceration. The for-profit prison industry had financial incentives to maintain high recidivism rates, which meant that effective mental health treatment was actually contrary to their business model. Providing adequate psychiatric care might have reduced the likelihood that mentally ill inmates would reoffend upon release, but this would have reduced the prison population and threatened profits. So while the pharmaceutical revolution brought real benefits for some mental health patients, it also created new problems and failed to address the fundamental issues of access, affordability, and comprehensive care. The promise of chemical cures for mental illness proved to be another false hope in the long history of failed treatments, leaving many patients better medicated but not necessarily better served by the mental health system. The late 20th and early 21st centuries have seen remarkable advances in understanding the brain and mental illness, but treatment approaches continue to be shaped by economic, political, and social factors that often prioritize cost containment over patient welfare. The integration of neuroscience, genetics, and psychology has provided new insights into mental health conditions, but translating this knowledge into effective treatments remains challenging. Brain imaging technologies like MRI and PET scans have allowed researchers to observe the living brain in ways that were impossible just decades ago. These tools have revealed differences in brain structure and function associated with various mental illnesses, supporting the idea that psychiatric conditions have biological bases. But imaging has also shown that the brain is far more complex and plastic than previously understood, complicating simple biological explanations for mental health problems. The promise of brain imaging was that it would provide objective diagnostic tools for mental illness, finally allowing psychiatry to move beyond subjective symptom assessments to measurable biological markers. However, decades of research have failed to identify reliable brain imaging signatures for most psychiatric conditions. The differences observed between healthy and mentally ill brains are often subtle, inconsistent across studies, and overlap significantly with normal variation. The excitement about neuroimaging led to premature claims about its clinical utility and potentially harmful applications. Some courts began accepting brain scans as evidence in criminal cases, despite the lack of scientific consensus about their reliability. Parents sought brain scans for children with behavioral problems, hoping for definitive answers that the technology couldn't provide. The overselling of brain imaging raised false hopes while diverting resources from more proven treatment approaches. Genetic research has identified hundreds of gene variants associated with mental illness, but each individual variant contributes only a tiny amount to overall risk. The hope for genetic tests that could predict or diagnose mental illness has largely been disappointed, as most psychiatric conditions appear to result from complex interactions between multiple genes and environmental factors. The promise of personalized medicine based on genetic profiles remains largely unfulfilled for mental health conditions. The Human Genome Project raised expectations that genetic research would revolutionize psychiatry within decades. Pharmaceutical companies invested billions in developing drugs based on genetic targets, while researchers promised that genetic testing would soon allow for personalized treatment selection. These predictions proved wildly optimistic, as the genetic architecture of mental illness turned out to be far more complex than anticipated. Direct-to-consumer genetic testing companies began marketing psychiatric risk assessments based on limited scientific evidence. Consumers could purchase tests that claimed to predict their likelihood of developing depression, bipolar disorder, or other mental health conditions. These tests often provided misleading information that caused unnecessary anxiety or false reassurance, while lacking the clinical utility needed for actual treatment decisions. The development of newer psychiatric medications has focused on reducing side effects rather than improving efficacy. SSRIs and other modern antidepressants are generally safer than earlier drugs, but they're not necessarily more effective. Many patients still don't respond to first-line treatments, and the process of finding the right medication often involves months or years of trial and error with significant side effects and withdrawal problems. The pharmaceutical industry's focus on developing "me-too" drugs that were similar to existing medications rather than pursuing genuinely innovative treatments reflected the conservative approach of an industry more concerned with predictable profits than breakthrough therapies. Patent extensions and marketing strategies often mattered more than therapeutic advances, leading to a proliferation of similar drugs with minimal clinical advantages. The serotonin hypothesis of depression, which formed the basis for SSRI development, was never definitively proven and has come under increasing scrutiny. Recent research suggests that depression may not be primarily caused by serotonin deficiency, raising questions about the theoretical foundation for the most commonly prescribed antidepressants. This doesn't mean SSRIs are ineffective, but it highlights how limited our understanding of mental illness mechanisms remains. Psychotherapy has evolved to include evidence-based approaches like cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectical behavior therapy, and eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. These treatments have strong research support for specific conditions, but access remains limited by cost, availability of trained therapists, and insurance coverage restrictions. Many patients can't afford therapy or must settle for brief, generic counseling that doesn't address their specific needs. The evidence-based practice movement brought scientific rigor to psychotherapy research but also created new problems. Manualized treatments that worked well in controlled research settings often proved difficult to implement in real-world clinical practice. The emphasis on standardized protocols sometimes interfered with the therapeutic relationship, which many clinicians considered the most important factor in treatment success. The commodification of psychotherapy led to the development of brief treatment protocols designed more for insurance reimbursement than therapeutic effectiveness. Patients with complex trauma histories or severe mental illness were often forced into short-term therapy models that couldn't adequately address their needs. The pressure to demonstrate rapid improvement sometimes led to superficial treatment that ignored underlying psychological issues. The digital revolution has created new opportunities for mental health treatment through telemedicine, smartphone apps, and online therapy platforms. These technologies can increase access to care and provide support between therapy sessions, but they also raise concerns about privacy, quality control, and the commercialization of mental health services. The COVID-19 pandemic accelerated the adoption of telehealth but also highlighted persistent inequalities in access to technology and reliable internet connections. Mental health apps proliferated rapidly without adequate research or regulation. Many made unsupported claims about their effectiveness while collecting sensitive personal data without adequate privacy protections. The lack of clinical oversight meant that potentially harmful apps could be marketed to vulnerable populations without any safety screening or professional supervision. The gamification of mental health treatment through apps and online platforms sometimes trivialized serious psychological conditions by reducing them to points, badges, and achievement levels. While these approaches might increase engagement for some users, they could also minimize the complexity of mental illness and promote superficial solutions to deep-seated problems. Alternative and complementary treatments have gained popularity as patients seek options beyond traditional psychiatric medications and therapy. Approaches like meditation, yoga, acupuncture, and nutritional interventions have research support for some conditions, but they're often not covered by insurance and may not be sufficient for severe mental illness. The integration of these approaches with conventional treatment remains challenging in a medical system that favors standardized protocols over individualized care. The alternative treatment movement sometimes promoted anti-psychiatry attitudes that discouraged patients from seeking proven medical interventions. While many complementary approaches have legitimate benefits, the rejection of conventional treatment could be dangerous for people with serious mental illnesses who needed medication or intensive therapy. The polarization between alternative and conventional approaches prevented the development of truly integrative treatment models. Some alternative practitioners made exaggerated claims about the ability of their treatments to cure mental illness without medication. These claims were particularly appealing to patients who had experienced side effects from psychiatric drugs or who felt failed by conventional treatment. However, the lack of regulation in the alternative treatment field meant that patients could be exploited by practitioners making unrealistic promises. The trauma-informed care movement has brought attention to the role of childhood abuse, neglect, and other adverse experiences in the development of mental illness. This perspective emphasizes the importance of addressing underlying trauma rather than just managing symptoms, but implementing trauma-informed approaches requires significant changes in how mental health services are organized and delivered. The recognition of trauma as a major factor in mental illness was long overdue, but the trauma-informed movement sometimes became so broad that it lost specificity and clinical utility. Not all mental health problems are trauma-related, and the emphasis on trauma could sometimes distract from other important factors like genetics, brain chemistry, and social conditions. The commercialization of trauma-informed care led to the development of expensive training programs and certification processes that may have enriched consultants more than they helped patients. Some organizations adopted trauma-informed policies as a marketing strategy rather than making meaningful changes to their treatment approaches. Peer support services, provided by people with lived experience of mental illness, have shown promise in helping individuals recover and maintain their mental health. Peer specialists can provide unique insights and support that complement professional treatment, but these services are often undervalued and underfunded compared to traditional medical approaches. The peer support movement challenged the medical model's emphasis on professional expertise by recognizing the value of experiential knowledge. However, the integration of peer services into traditional treatment systems was often difficult, as medical professionals sometimes questioned the qualifications and boundaries of peer support workers. The professionalization of peer support through certification and training requirements helped establish credibility but also raised questions about whether peer workers would lose their unique perspective as they became more integrated into traditional treatment systems. The balance between maintaining authenticity and achieving professional recognition remains an ongoing challenge. The recovery movement has challenged the assumption that serious mental illness inevitably leads to lifelong disability, emphasizing that many people can achieve meaningful lives despite ongoing psychiatric symptoms. This perspective has influenced treatment approaches to focus more on personal goals and functional outcomes rather than just symptom reduction, but it has also been criticized for potentially minimizing the real challenges faced by people with severe mental illness. The recovery philosophy provided hope and inspiration for many people with mental illness, but it was sometimes interpreted in ways that blamed individuals for their lack of progress or suggested that medication was unnecessary for recovery. The emphasis on personal responsibility could ignore the social and economic barriers that prevented many people from achieving their recovery goals. The institutionalization of recovery principles in mental health systems sometimes led to the development of new bureaucratic requirements and documentation burdens that interfered with actual service delivery. Recovery-oriented policies were often implemented in ways that served administrative needs rather than client preferences. Mental health parity laws have required insurance companies to provide equal coverage for mental health and substance abuse treatment, but implementation has been inconsistent and many barriers to access remain. The shortage of mental health providers, particularly in rural and low-income areas, continues to limit treatment options for many people who need care. Parity laws were an important step toward addressing discrimination against people with mental illness, but they didn't address fundamental problems in the mental health system like provider shortages, inadequate reimbursement rates, and the lack of integration between mental health and primary care services. Many insurance companies found ways to circumvent parity requirements through prior authorization processes and network restrictions. The enforcement of parity laws was often inadequate, leaving patients to navigate complex appeals processes when their insurance denied mental health coverage. The burden of proving parity violations fell on individual patients who were often too ill or too overwhelmed to pursue legal remedies. The opioid epidemic has highlighted the complex relationship between mental illness and substance abuse, leading to increased focus on integrated treatment approaches. But the crisis has also strained mental health resources and contributed to rising suicide rates, particularly among middle-aged white men who have been disproportionately affected by opioid addiction and economic displacement. The opioid crisis revealed the dangers of overprescribing and inadequate monitoring of psychiatric medications. The same pharmaceutical marketing strategies that drove antidepressant overprescribing were used to promote opioid painkillers, suggesting that the mental health field had not learned from its previous mistakes with medication promotion. The criminalization of drug addiction created additional barriers to mental health treatment for people with co-occurring substance use disorders. The stigma associated with addiction often prevented people from seeking help for mental health problems, while criminal records related to drug use limited access to employment, housing, and other social supports necessary for recovery. School-based mental health programs have expanded in response to concerns about rising rates of anxiety and depression among children and adolescents. These programs can provide early intervention and support for young people, but they're often limited by funding constraints and concerns about pathologizing normal developmental challenges. The medicalization of childhood behavior through school-based mental health programs sometimes led to overdiagnosis and overtreatment of normal developmental variations. Children who were active, creative, or non-conforming were sometimes labeled as having psychiatric disorders that required medication or therapy, potentially interfering with normal psychological development. The integration of mental health services into schools raised questions about confidentiality, parental rights, and the appropriate role of educational institutions in addressing psychological problems. Some parents welcomed school-based services as a way to access care that they couldn't afford privately, while others worried about the long-term consequences of having their children labeled as mentally ill. The stigma surrounding mental illness has decreased somewhat, with more public figures sharing their experiences and greater awareness of mental health issues. But discrimination persists in employment, housing, and other areas, and many people still avoid seeking treatment due to fear of social or professional consequences. Anti-stigma campaigns often focused on promoting understanding and acceptance without addressing the structural barriers that prevented people with mental illness from accessing quality care. Public awareness efforts could reduce prejudice while the underlying problems of inadequate funding, provider shortages, and insurance discrimination remained unchanged. The commercialization of mental health awareness through pharmaceutical advertising and corporate sponsorship sometimes co-opted anti-stigma messages for marketing purposes. Companies that profited from mental illness treatment funded awareness campaigns that promoted their products while appearing to advocate for patients. So while our understanding of mental illness has advanced dramatically, the treatment system continues to struggle with fundamental challenges of access, quality, and coordination. The promise of precision medicine and personalized treatment approaches remains largely unrealized, and many patients still face the same barriers to care that have existed for decades. The history of mental illness treatment shows that scientific progress doesn't automatically translate into better patient outcomes without addressing the social, economic, and political factors that shape how care is delivered. Throughout this entire horrifying journey of mental illness treatment, one thing becomes painfully clear: the people who suffered the most were always the patients themselves. They were beaten, tortured, drugged, cut open, and abandoned in the name of healing. They were guinea pigs for every new theory, victims of every medical fad, and casualties of society's fear and ignorance about mental illness. The doctors and researchers who performed these treatments weren't necessarily evil people. Many genuinely believed they were helping their patients and advancing medical knowledge. But their good intentions don't excuse the harm they caused or absolve them of responsibility for the suffering they inflicted. The history of mental illness treatment is a reminder that medical authority and good intentions are not enough to protect vulnerable people from abuse. The most tragic aspect of this history is how often treatments that seemed promising initially turned out to cause more harm than good. Lobotomy was hailed as a breakthrough that would revolutionize psychiatry. Electroshock therapy was seen as a humane alternative to mechanical restraints. Psychiatric medications were marketed as miracle cures that would empty mental hospitals. Each generation of practitioners believed they had finally found the answer, only to have their methods discredited by later research. The pattern of initial enthusiasm followed by gradual recognition of harm has repeated throughout the history of mental health treatment. New treatments are often adopted based on limited evidence and theoretical appeal rather than rigorous scientific testing. The pressure to find quick solutions to complex problems leads to premature implementation of interventions that may cause more harm than benefit. The economic factors that have shaped mental illness treatment throughout history continue to influence care today. Mental health services have always been underfunded compared to other medical specialties, and patients with mental illness have been seen as less deserving of resources and attention. The profit motive has driven the development and marketing of treatments that may not be in patients' best interests, from the patent medicine era through today's pharmaceutical industry. The commodification of mental health care has turned human suffering into market opportunities. Companies profit from the chronicity of mental illness rather than its cure, creating financial incentives to maintain rather than resolve psychological problems. The transformation of therapy into a commodity has changed the therapeutic relationship from a healing partnership into a commercial transaction. The role of social control in mental illness treatment cannot be ignored. Throughout history, psychiatric diagnosis and treatment have been used to silence political dissidents, control women and minorities, and enforce social conformity. The definition of mental illness has always been influenced by cultural values and power structures, not just medical knowledge. This legacy continues to shape how mental health conditions are understood and treated today. The medicalization of social problems has expanded the reach of psychiatric intervention while avoiding addressing the underlying social conditions that contribute to psychological distress. Poverty, discrimination, violence, and social isolation are treated as individual mental health problems rather than collective social issues requiring systemic solutions. The institutionalization and deinstitutionalization cycles show how policy changes intended to improve patient welfare can have unintended consequences. Closing state hospitals was supposed to integrate mental patients into communities, but it often left them without adequate support. The current emphasis on evidence-based practice and quality metrics may improve some aspects of care while creating new barriers for patients whose needs don't fit standardized protocols. The pendulum swings in mental health policy often reflect political and economic considerations rather than clinical evidence or patient preferences. Reform movements are sometimes driven more by cost-cutting than genuine concern for patient welfare, leading to changes that appear progressive while actually reducing access to care. The medicalization of human distress has expanded the reach of psychiatric treatment but may have also pathologized normal responses to difficult life circumstances. The line between mental illness and normal human suffering has become increasingly blurred, potentially creating more patients while diverting resources from those with the most severe conditions. The pharmaceutical industry's influence on psychiatric practice has created a culture where medication is often seen as the first and most important intervention for mental health problems. This biochemical reductionism ignores the psychological, social, and spiritual dimensions of human suffering while promoting solutions that benefit drug manufacturers more than patients. Looking at this history, it's clear that progress in mental health treatment has been slow, uneven, and often interrupted by setbacks. Each generation has had to rediscover basic principles of humane care that were forgotten or ignored by their predecessors. The fundamental challenges of understanding and treating mental illness remain largely unsolved despite centuries of effort and enormous investments in research and treatment development. The cyclical nature of mental health reform suggests that progress is not linear or permanent. Advances in one area are often accompanied by regressions in others, while innovations that seem promising often turn out to have serious limitations or unintended consequences. The complexity of mental illness defies simple solutions and quick fixes. The patients who survived these treatments deserve recognition not just as victims but as pioneers who endured unimaginable suffering while contributing to our eventual understanding of mental illness. Their experiences, though often ignored or dismissed, provided crucial information about what doesn't work in mental health treatment. Their resilience and survival in the face of systematic abuse demonstrates the human capacity to endure and recover even under the most adverse circumstances. The stories of treatment survivors are often the most valuable sources of information about the effectiveness and humanity of different interventions. Their perspectives challenge professional assumptions and provide insights that research studies often miss. The psychiatric survivor movement has played a crucial role in exposing abuses and advocating for more humane treatment approaches. The families and advocates who fought for better treatment conditions, often against fierce resistance from medical and political establishments, played crucial roles in reforming mental health care. Their efforts remind us that progress requires persistent advocacy and willingness to challenge authority when patients are being harmed. Family members often bore the burden of caring for relatives with mental illness while fighting for access to appropriate services. Their advocacy efforts led to important legal protections, funding increases, and policy changes that improved conditions for countless patients. The family advocacy movement continues to push for better services and reduced stigma. The current state of mental health treatment, while far from perfect, represents genuine progress compared to the horrors of the past. Most patients today receive treatment that is at least intended to help rather than harm them. The emphasis on informed consent, patient rights, and evidence-based practice provides some protection against the worst abuses, though vigilance is still required to prevent new forms of maltreatment. The development of ethical oversight mechanisms like institutional review boards and patient advocacy programs has created safeguards that didn't exist in earlier eras. While these protections are not perfect, they represent important advances in protecting vulnerable populations from research exploitation and treatment abuses. But we cannot be complacent about this progress. The same factors that enabled past abuses, including stigma, underfunding, social inequality, and the vulnerability of mental health patients, continue to create risks today. The history of mental illness treatment serves as a warning about what can happen when society fails to protect its most vulnerable members and when medical authority goes unchecked by ethical oversight and patient advocacy. The contemporary mental health system still exhibits many of the problematic patterns that characterized earlier eras. Economic interests often override clinical considerations, social control functions persist alongside therapeutic goals, and vulnerable populations continue to bear the burden of experimental treatments and systemic neglect. So the next time you hear about a new breakthrough in mental health treatment, remember this history. Ask hard questions about the evidence supporting new treatments. Demand transparency about risks and side effects. Advocate for adequate funding and access to care. And never forget that behind every statistic and research finding are real people whose lives hang in the balance. The responsibility for preventing future abuses lies with all of us. Professionals must maintain ethical standards and speak out against harmful practices. Policymakers must prioritize patient welfare over cost considerations. The public must remain engaged and vigilant about the treatment of vulnerable populations. And patients and families must continue to advocate for their rights and needs. By now you've probably realized that the history of mental illness treatment isn't a story of steady progress from ignorance to enlightenment. It's a horrifying chronicle of human suffering inflicted in the name of healing, punctuated by occasional genuine advances that were often undermined by economic interests, social prejudice, and medical arrogance. The people we've entrusted with healing minds have, more often than not, broken them further. You wouldn't have survived as a mental health patient in any previous era, not because you're weak, but because the treatments were designed to control and punish rather than heal and support. You would have been chained in a dungeon, tortured with exorcisms, lobotomized into compliance, or drugged into submission. Your suffering would have been seen as necessary, your protests as symptoms, and your humanity as inconvenient. You'd be strapped to a table while electricity coursed through your brain, convinced that the convulsions would somehow cure your depression. You'd wake up with no memory of who you were or why you were there, told that this was therapeutic progress. You'd be injected with insulin until you slipped into a diabetic coma, gambling your life on the hope that unconsciousness would reset your troubled mind. If you were a woman, you'd face additional horrors. Your depression might be blamed on your wandering womb, your anxiety attributed to excessive education, your anger diagnosed as hysteria requiring immediate institutionalization. You'd be sterilized to prevent you from passing on your defective genes, isolated from your children to protect them from your influence, and subjected to treatments designed to make you compliant rather than healthy. If you belong to a racial or ethnic minority, you'd be used as evidence for racist theories about mental inferiority and subjected to experimental treatments too dangerous for white patients. Your cultural differences would be pathologized, your trauma ignored, and your protests dismissed as proof of your mental deficiency. Even if you survived the treatments, you'd face a lifetime of stigma and discrimination. You'd be barred from employment, denied housing, and shunned by society. Your medical records would follow you everywhere, marking you as dangerous and unreliable. You'd live with the constant fear that any display of emotion or unusual behavior could result in your reinstitutionalization. And the worst part? The people inflicting these horrors would convince themselves they were helping you. The doctors would publish papers about their innovative techniques. The families would feel relieved to have their problem relatives safely locked away. Society would congratulate itself on its humane treatment of the mentally ill while continuing to fund research into increasingly barbaric treatments. So no, you wouldn't have made it through the historical mental health system because it wasn't designed for your survival or recovery. It was designed to make you disappear, to transform you into something more manageable, or to use you as experimental material for theories that had no basis in reality. Your mental illness would have been seen as a moral failing, a spiritual weakness, or a genetic defect that needed to be corrected, controlled, or eliminated. The mental health treatment system may have evolved beyond the worst horrors of the past, but its legacy lives on in every patient who still faces discrimination, every family bankrupted by treatment costs, and every person who suffers in silence because they fear the consequences of seeking help. The history of mental illness treatment reminds us that progress is fragile and that the same prejudices and economic pressures that enabled past abuses continue to threaten vulnerable people today. So the next time someone dismisses mental illness as weakness or claims that psychiatric treatment is always beneficial, remember this history. Remember the patients who were tortured in the name of healing, the families destroyed by forced institutionalization, and the generations of suffering caused by ignorance and arrogance disguised as medical authority. Remember that every advance in mental health care was paid for with human suffering and that vigilance is required to prevent new forms of abuse. The chains may be gone, but the struggle for truly humane and effective mental health treatment continues. In honoring the memory of those who suffered through this dark history, we commit ourselves to building a better future for everyone whose mind needs healing rather than punishment, understanding rather than fear, and hope rather than despair. The lessons of the past must guide us toward a future where mental illness is met with compassion, science, and genuine care rather than fear, superstition, and systematic cruelty.